Outspoken political commentator and author Anthea Jeffery joins me to discuss her book titled People's War. What period of South Africa's history does your book People's War describe?
It covers in particular the period from 1984 to 1994, because that's the period during which the People's War was being implemented. But it does start earlier than that. It deals rather briefly perhaps with what happened in 1960 when the ANC was unbanned, how the ANC then shifted to the adoption of armed struggle. And then it particularly takes up the story from 1976 when the Soweto revolt broke out. And the ANC at that point had very little presence inside the country. It had been banned since 1960. Its armed wing, Umkhonto was struggling to gain access in order to carry out attacks. And really what had happened was that the ANC had been much supplanted by two internal organizations, the Black Consciousness Movement, which had sparked the Soweto revolt, and the Inkatha, as it was called at that point, which had been formed in 1975, and whose membership really grew very rapidly, particularly after the failure of the Soweto revolt, when it became clear that you needed a more comprehensive policy in order to confront apartheid.
And you seem to be critical of the way in which the ANC waged its struggle to overthrow apartheid. Do you think that apartheid could have been brought to an end without such a struggle?
I don't think you needed the People's War. And I think one must look particularly to the period when the People's War was the most intense. It began in 1984. Between then and 1989, about 5,500 people died in the course of the People's War. And after 1990, after political liberalization, when F.W. de Klerk had unbanned the ANC and the SACP and other organizations and had made it clear that he wanted negotiations for a new South Africa, and had also told the police and army that there must come an end to some of the abuses which had happened in the 1980s, such as the killing of Matthew Ganiwe. At that point, the killings tripled. And so we had a death toll which had been 5,500 in the first 5 years. It was 15,000 between 1990 and 1994. And at that point it was clear that the door to democracy had already been thrown open, that there was no need to batter it down through that intensified violence.
And can you explain to us what is the difference between the People's War and a conventional war?
A People's War is very different because in many ways it revolves around organization, trying to draw people into a whole range of organizations, and also propaganda, one of its most important elements. But in essence it regards people as its weapons of war, hence the term People's War. So everybody who is living within an arena of conflict will be regarded as a weapon of war and is expendable in the same way as the arms and ammunition of a conventional conflict are expendable. And so people can either be drawn in to waging the struggles, the political struggles or the military struggles, or they can become victims of the military struggle in particular, of the program of violence. Either way, there are weapons in the People's War, and if they die in the course of it, this is basically regarded as something that doesn't matter that much. There's no distinction drawn between military and civilian targets. Civilians are expendable too, as are children.
And briefly talk to us more about the 1984 march in Sebokeng, Sharpeville and other townships in the industrial Vaal Triangle against the R6 monthly rent increase, which saw some of the Luoka councillors injured and some were burnt to death.
Yeah. That was the start of the People's War. I should perhaps just briefly explain that the ANC, really at the urging of the Soviet Union, had gone to Vietnam in 1978 to learn about People's War and how it should be waged. And they'd come back and they'd been now preparing for People's War for a number of years. But in 1984 they saw an opportunity because there'd been a great deal of anger against the black local authorities, particularly because they were portrayed as being some sort of substitute for black participation in the tricameral parliament. And naturally there was a great deal of anger over that. And then of course there's always financial hardship. So when the Lokoa Town Council announced a rather small increase of R6 a month, initially there wasn't that much resistance to it, perhaps because the amount was not that big. But once the UDF, which was the ANC's internal wing, with of its 25 people on its National Executive Committee, only one was not a member of the ANC secretly. They started whipping up anger, and they also organized, because you need to organize violence. It doesn't often happen completely spontaneously. So there were groups of people who were brought into the townships in advance and who were equipped with petrol bombs and stones and so on, and who were really encouraged to target black local councillors in the area. And the upshot was that 2 local councillors died on that first day in the most really dreadful circumstances. Mobs surrounded their home, threw petrol bombs into it. When they came out to escape the flames, they were set upon and killed. And in the end, in that upsurge of violence in the Vaal Triangle, there were something like 60 people who died. And many of them did die at the hands of the state, because as the violence intensified, so the police came to the conclusion that the only way that they could protect civilians, the only way they could damp down the violence, was to use sharp ammunition. So it set in motion a tremendous confrontation on the streets of the townships, and that was the beginning of the People's War.
Talk to us more about Oliver Tambo and his colleagues Joe Slovo, Moses Mabhida, Thabo Mbeki and other senior leaders in the ANC and SACP's visit to Vietnam, and how Gibbs' formula for People's War impacted on ANC strategy and tactics.
I'll try, yes. The ANC up to now had been trying to wage an armed struggle. In other words, they put a lot of emphasis on sabotage attacks to be carried out by MK. But it was very difficult to get MK back into the country. People's War really puts more emphasis on the 2 aspects of it. There must be political struggles as well as military struggles, or the violence program. And the political struggles will take many forms familiar to South Africans: rent boycotts, school boycotts, stayaways, strikes, and so on. And the most important element, though, in the political struggle is the propaganda campaign, because it's very important to obscure what is really happening and to put the blame for the escalating violence on particular people, especially the government and especially the ANC's black rivals, Inkatha and the BC organizations. On the other hand, you have the military struggle, and that is very much not about bomb blasts. You might have some bomb blasts still, but what you really want is terror to bring the population into line. So something like necklace executions is vital to that. And secondly, your vital aim in the course of waging a people's war, here as it was in Vietnam, is to eliminate your political opposition. So very many of the attacks were aimed at the BC organizations or were aimed at Inkatha. So in the case of BC, for example, one of the first people to be killed was a BC activist who'd spent many years on Robben Island. He'd been imprisoned by the apartheid state, and yet he was necklaced on the streets of Soweto, because that sent such a powerful message to people that you didn't dare to show support for BC, that it was much safer to belong to the UDF or to show support for the UDF. And there was really a tremendous amount of violence which took place in Soweto against BC, but an even greater amount of violence that took place in Natal against Inkatha. And Inkatha was also quite effective at fighting back. And the result was really an upsurge of violence from 1987 onwards in KwaZulu-Natal, in which something like 2,400 people died.
And you argue that the Inkatha Freedom Party leader, Prince Mangosuthu Buthelez's strategy for liberation was very different from the ANC. But was the IFP not also involved in undertaking violent attacks and strategies?
I don't think that the IFP ever saw violence as a strategy. I mean, that was one of the critical things that Prince Mangosuthu said distinguished Inkatha from the ANC. He used the ANC colours. He saw Inkatha as a continuation of the ANC as it had been in its early years, before it became effectively hijacked by the SACP and brought under Moscow's influence and espoused strategies like People's War and necklacing. And he thought that you could still confront the apartheid system using the growing consumer and labour power of the black population. He never said that they would never turn to violence, but he thought that you should explore those non-violent options first. But when Inkatha Sir came under attack, and again there were necklacings that were directed at Inkatha people. And there were assaults on the street to force people to take part in school boycotts and rent boycotts and the like. As I said, Inkatha also fought back. And so you got this escalation in violence between the two. But I think the difference was that Inkatha's attacks were generally retaliatory, and sometimes they would be massive, and they would affect a large number of people, and it was quite unacceptable. But on the other hand, they didn't have a strategy of violence. They didn't plan to unleash violence in order to destroy their rivals, which is what the ANC planned to do and then did do.
What, in your opinion, have been the consequences for today's South Africa of the ANC-led People's War to overthrow apartheid?
Well, I think that if we hadn't had the People's War, if particularly in 1990 when we had political liberalisation, the ANC had agreed to give up the armed struggle, give up the People's War, and there had really been a process of peaceful negotiation at that point. To begin with, I think we would have had far fewer deaths, 15,000 fewer deaths. Secondly, we would have not had such a weakening of the ANC's black rivals, who were further destroyed in that period, both BC and the IFP. So we began our new democracy without the most important criterion, which is a realistic prospect of the ruling party being voted out of power. By then, there was no real opposition to the ANC at all, and it's taken a long time for any other opposition to grow up, perhaps in the form of the DA, though it does seem to have lost direction recently. And the other thing is that we taught people the techniques of ungovernability. We taught that attacking the police is okay. And we taught people that you can resort to violence if that is what you think will help you win your objective. And we encouraged, among young people in particular, the use of quite heinous techniques of violence. I think anybody who witnessed or participated in a necklacing must be fundamentally affected by it psychologically. We created a climate of fear, and it's not a sound basis on which to build up a new democracy. And we probably made it very much more difficult to uphold the rule of law, to bring the requisite level of order back into the society. And perhaps if one quotes what Prince Mangosuthu Buthelezi said back in 1986, there's validity in it. He said, if we make the country ungovernable now, it will still be ungovernable after liberation.
And lastly, why did you see it befitting to commemorate the life and work of Marjorie Britton with this book?
Really because she thought there was value in writing the story of the People's War. And she belonged to a trust called the Donaldson Trust, which provided what certainly in today's terms sounds like not very much money, but it helped us to get going on the project and in the end to bring it to a conclusion. And we thought it was fitting, because some of the resources for the work had come from the Donaldson Trust and from Marjorie Britton's particular urging that this project should be tackled, that we should acknowledge her contribution to it.
That was Anthea Jeffery speaking to Creamer Media's Polity about her book titled People's War.